My parents took my inheritance and gave it to my brother. They did it in front of a lawyer, with smiles they didn't try to hide. And when the attorney read the last page, I didn't feel angry. I felt relieved. That reaction still confuses people when I tell them. Confused me too at the time. Relief isn't what you expect when your own parents declare you not worth it. Relief isn't what you expect when a lifetime of assumptions collapses in a quiet, carpeted conference room. So before you decide what kind of person you think I am, stay with me for a minute. Not because this is a revenge story. It isn't. And not because everything ends neatly. Doesn't. Stay because the moment you think you understand who was right and who was wrong is exactly the moment the story gets uncomfortable. This happened 3 years ago, a few weeks after my grandfather died. I was 29. Old enough to think I knew my family. Young enough to still believe that loyalty counted for something. The will reading took place on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember that detail because I had asked my manager to leave early, and I'd rehearsed what I would say if anyone questioned it. A family obligation. That's what I called it. I said it easily, without hesitation, like it was still a safe word to use. The office was small and overly warm. Beige walls. A framed print of a sailboat that looked like it had been chosen to offend no one. My mother sat next to my father, knees angled toward him, her purse clutched tight against her side. My brother sat across from me, scrolling on his phone, one ankle resting casually on his knee. And me? I sat there calm. Truly calm. I wasn't expecting a fight. I wasn't expecting a surprise. I honestly believed that whatever happened would be fair, or at least understandable. That belief mattered more than I realized. When the attorney began reading, I watched my parents more than I listened. My mother nodded along at certain phrases, like she'd already heard them. My father cleared his throat twice in the same way. He always did when he was preparing to say something important, or something final. Then the sentence came. The one that changed how I see my childhood. My father spoke before the attorney could finish. He smiled not at me but at my brother. And he said, "We've decided Amelia's portion will be transferred. She doesn't need it. She's not worth it." No shouting. No raised voices. Just a decision delivered like a line item in a budget meeting. I felt something leave my body in that moment. Not anger. Not sadness. Something quieter. Like tension finally releasing from a muscle I hadn't known was clenched for years. The attorney paused. Just for a second. She flipped one page. And that's where I need to stop explaining and start promising you something instead. Because this story isn't about money. Not really. It's about what happens when the people who shaped you finally say the quiet part out loud. It's about realizing that the version of yourself you built to survive them was never the problem. I'm going to tell you exactly how we got to that room. What I believed before I sat down. What I ignored. And why, when my mother's hand started shaking and my brother finally looked up from his phone, I didn't feel victorious. I felt understood. And if that doesn't make sense yet, that's okay. It didn't make sense to me either. Not until much later. Before any of this happened, I believed my family was solid. Not perfect. Not warm in the way movies sell it. But stable. Dependable. The kind of family where you might not say "I love you" out loud very often, but you showed up. You paid your share. You did what was expected. That was the language I grew up fluent in. My grandfather, my mom's father, was the quiet center of it all. He wasn't sentimental. He didn't give hugs unless you leaned in first. But he noticed things. He remembered details. When I was 13 and said I wanted to study architecture, he mailed me a book about women who design bridges. No note. Just the book. Kept it. We weren't especially close in a confessional way. We didn't talk about feelings. But there was an understanding between us that felt steady. Predictable. If I showed up, he saw me. That was enough. My parents, on the other hand, believed in hierarchy. They never used that word, but it lived in our house. Older before younger. Louder before quieter. Needs that looked practical before needs that looked emotional. My brother Daniel fit easily into their structure. He needed help loudly. He failed publicly. He asked without embarrassment. When he messed up, there was always a reason, always context. Always a cushion. I learned early that being easy was valuable. That not needing too much bought you goodwill. So I adapted. I did well in school. I worked part-time jobs. I paid my own rent as soon as I could. When I needed help, I softened the ask until it barely sounded like one. At the time, I thought this made me mature. Family gatherings followed a pattern. My mother coordinated. My father commented. My brother dominated the space with stories that went on too long. I listened. I nodded. I cleaned up without being asked. If something felt unfair, I told myself it was temporary. If something hurt, I assumed it wasn't intentional. I believed intention mattered more than impact. When my grandfather got sick, that belief solidified. I visited when I could. Sat with him in silence. Read the newspaper aloud when his eyes got tired. My parents handled logistics. Daniel rarely came, always had a reason. Work was busy. Traffic was bad. He meant to call. No one accused him. No one asked more of him. When my grandfather died, the grief was quiet. No dramatic scenes. No arguments over belongings. My mother said, "He took care of things," and I believed her. I didn't ask questions. I didn't feel entitled to anything beyond closure. The idea of an inheritance barely crossed my mind. If I thought about it at all, it was abstract. A future thing. Something symbolic, maybe. Not something that would change my life. That's important. I didn't walk into that lawyer's office expecting a win. What I expected was continuity. The will reading was framed as procedural. A formality. My mother even joked about how boring it would be. She said, "We'll be in and out." My father said, "No surprises." Daniel rolled his eyes and asked if there would be parking validation. And there it was. A tiny pause. A flicker I ignored. I remember my mother hesitating when I asked who the attorney was. Just a beat too long before she said the name. I remember my father answering questions that weren't directed at him. I remember Daniel smirking at his phone before we even sat down. None of it registered as danger. I explained it away in real time. Stress. Grief. Personality quirks. Now let me ask you something before I go further. Have you ever had that gut feeling that something was off, but you ignored it because you didn't want to believe it? Tell me in the comments. I want to know I'm not alone in this. Because I walked into that room believing that even if things weren't equal, they would at least be honest. That whatever happened would make sense once it was explained. I didn't know yet that I was about to learn how carefully my family had been explaining things away to me my entire life. And I definitely didn't know that the safety I thought I'd earned by being easy was about to disappear the moment I stopped being useful. The first moment something actually felt wrong didn't happen in the lawyer's office. It happened the week before, in my parents' kitchen. I'd stopped by to drop off some documents my mom said she needed. Copies of my ID, an old address, small things that didn't raise alarms. She was at the counter, sorting papers into neat piles, her glasses perched low on her nose. My father sat at the table, reading the same page of the newspaper over and over. Daniel wasn't there. That should have been ordinary. Somehow it wasn't. When I asked what the papers were for, my mother said, "Just housekeeping." She didn't look up when she said it. Her tone was light. Practiced. I remember nodding, even though something tightened in my chest. Housekeeping had never required my ID before. I stayed for coffee. We talked about nothing. The weather. A neighbor's renovation. My dad's knee. I noticed how careful they were being with their words, like every sentence had been pre-approved. When my phone buzzed, my mother flinched. That was new. On my way out, I asked casually if there was anything I should prepare for the will reading. Financial paperwork, maybe. She smiled too quickly and said, "No, sweetheart. It's all very straightforward." Sweetheart was rare. It landed wrong. That night, I replayed the afternoon in my head. I told myself I was being paranoid. Grief does strange things to people. I'd read that somewhere. I reminded myself that my parents had always been practical, not emotional. This was just them being them. Still, I couldn't sleep. A few days later, Daniel called me. That alone was unusual. We weren't estranged, but we weren't chatty either. When I answered, he sounded upbeat, almost celebratory. "So," he said, "big day coming up." I asked what he meant even though I knew. He laughed. "The will thing. You excited?" That word again. Excited. Like this was a promotion or a vacation. I said something non-committal. Asked how he was doing. He talked for a while about work, about a new apartment he was thinking of, about how expensive everything was getting. Then just before hanging up he said, "Hey, don't take this the wrong way, okay?" I waited. Mom and Dad have been handling most of it. They just want to make sure things go smoothly. Go smoothly. Another phrase that didn't belong. After we hung up, I sat on my couch and stared at the wall longer than I want to admit. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I was unsettled. Like I'd walked into a room where a conversation had stopped too abruptly. I considered asking my parents directly what was going on. The thought made my stomach twist. Confrontation had never been my strength. I told myself there was nothing to confront. No evidence. No accusation I could make without sounding ungrateful or dramatic. So I did what I'd always done. I stayed quiet and watched. In the days leading up to the will reading, small things kept piling up. My mother stopped calling. My father responded to texts with one-word answers. Daniel posted a picture of champagne on his Instagram story with no caption. I stared at it longer than I should have, trying to decide if it meant anything. I asked myself over and over, am I imagining this? Part of me wanted to believe that if something was wrong, someone would tell me. That my family, for all its flaws, wouldn't shut me out completely. That there was a line they wouldn't cross. The morning of the will reading, I stood in front of my mirror and adjusted my jacket. I looked like myself. Put together. Calm. Capable. I remember thinking, whatever happens, I'll handle it. What I didn't know was that by staying quiet, I was giving everyone else permission to continue a plan that had already been set in motion. So pause for a second. What would you have done in my position? Confronted them immediately or stayed quiet and watched? Drop your answer below. The lawyer's office smelled faintly like lemon cleaner and old paper. The kind of place designed to feel neutral, as if neutrality itself could protect you from what was about to be said. We'd been seated for maybe 5 minutes when the attorney began reading. Her voice was even. Professional. She didn't rush. That alone made me uneasy. I'd expected speed. Efficiency. Get it over with. The first few items were exactly what you'd expect. Assets listed. Accounts named. My grandfather's house mentioned. Then quickly clarified as already transferred years ago. My parents nodded along, synchronized. Daniel barely looked up. Then came a pause. The attorney glanced down, adjusted her glasses and continued. She read my brother's name. Once. Then again. Properties. A trust. Something about educational debts being resolved. I told myself this was fine. Daniel had always needed more help. This was probably just timing. Then my name came up. Briefly. A single sentence about a smaller account, described in careful legal language. Before the attorney could continue, my father leaned forward slightly and cleared his throat. "We've already discussed this," he said, smiling politely. "Amelia's portion will be consolidated. It makes more sense that way." The attorney looked at him, then at my mother. My mother nodded. I felt heat rise in my neck. Not panic yet, just confusion. "Consolidated how?" I asked. My father answered without looking at me. "Transferred to Daniel. You're doing fine on your own." My mother added softly. "He needs it more." That was the first betrayal. Not the money. The assumption. The way they spoke about me instead of to me. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the attorney raised her hand slightly. A polite interruption. "There is an addendum," she said. "Before any consolidation occurs, I'm required to read the remaining clause." My mother stiffened. It was subtle, but I saw it. Her fingers tightened around her purse strap. Daniel finally put his phone down. The attorney turned one page. Before she read it, something small happened. Something that hurt more than I expected. My mother leaned toward Daniel and whispered, "It's okay." She didn't look at me when she said it. That was the micro-betrayal. The moment I realized whatever was coming, they already knew. And they hadn't bothered to prepare me. The attorney began reading. The clause was written in my grandfather's voice. Not legally, but unmistakably him. Direct. Unembellished. He stated that any redistribution of my share, any attempt to override the original intent, would trigger a separate provision. A private letter. To be read aloud. My mother's hand started shaking before the letter even began. The attorney read it anyway. My grandfather wrote that he had observed patterns in the family, that he'd worried about fairness being confused with convenience, that he'd seen how responsibility was rewarded with silence, while chaos was rewarded with attention. He named no one directly. He didn't have to. He stated that if my inheritance was reassigned without my consent, the remainder of the estate would be redirected to a charitable trust, one my parents had no access to, one Daniel couldn't touch. And then came the sentence that broke something open inside me. He wrote that I was not included despite my independence but because of it, that he trusted me to stand on my own, and trusted that I would recognize the truth when it finally showed itself. The room went very quiet. My father's smile vanished. My mother stared at the table like it might give her instructions. Daniel's face flushed, then hardened. I felt dizzy. Not victorious. Not satisfied. Just hollowed out. The attorney finished reading and folded the letter carefully. She looked at me then. Not with pity. With acknowledgement. I realized in that moment that this hadn't been a misunderstanding. It hadn't been clumsy planning or poor communication. It had been intentional. Planned. Discussed without me. This wasn't just betrayal. This was my entire reality collapsing. Have you ever been blindsided like this? Share below if you've lived it. Because as I sat there, surrounded by people I'd spent my life accommodating, I understood something I'd never allowed myself to consider before. They hadn't underestimated me. They'd counted on me staying quiet. And that realization dropped me to the lowest place I'd ever been, because it meant the version of love I thought I'd earned had never really existed at all. I didn't say anything right away. That surprised everyone. I could feel it in the room. The pause stretched longer than was comfortable, and still I stayed quiet. Not frozen. Not stunned. Just still. Like something inside me had finally settled into place. For the first time, I wasn't scrambling to interpret their reactions or manage their discomfort. I wasn't trying to be fair. Or reasonable. Or easy. I was listening to myself. The attorney asked if anyone had questions. My father started to speak, then stopped. My mother finally looked at me. Really looked like she was trying to assess damage. Amelia, she said carefully, you understand this isn't personal. That was the moment I felt something go cold. Not angry. Cold. Because I did understand. Completely. And that understanding changed everything. I realized then that nothing I said in that room would rewrite history. No explanation would make them see me differently. They hadn't misunderstood my strength. They'd used it as justification. So instead of reacting, I observed. I noticed how my father avoided the attorney's eyes now. How Daniel kept shifting in his seat, recalculating. How my mother's voice had lost its softness and gained an edge, like she was preparing to defend something she'd already decided was hers. The meeting ended quickly after that. Logistics were deferred. The attorney gave me her card and said we could talk privately if I wanted. My parents gathered their things in silence. Daniel stood up too fast and knocked his chair back. No one apologized. That mattered. In the days that followed, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't ask for closure. I did something far less dramatic and far more difficult. I stepped back. I took time off work. I let my phone ring. I sat alone in my apartment and replayed my life with a level of honesty I'd never allowed myself before. Not to blame them. To understand me. I thought about every time I'd been praised for being low maintenance. Every time I'd been told, you'll be fine. Every time my needs were treated as optional because I didn't insist on them. I realized I'd been confusing self-sufficiency with self-erasure. The clarity didn't come all at once. It came in waves. Some days I felt foolish for not seeing it sooner. Other days I felt protective of my younger self, who had done the best she could with the information she had. And slowly, quietly, I began to make plans. Not revenge plans. Boundary plans. I met with the attorney again. Asked questions. Listened more than I spoke. I updated my documents. Changed beneficiaries. Made decisions that reflected who I was now, not who I'd been trying to be for others. I limited contact with my parents. Not dramatically. Just intentionally. Shorter calls. Fewer explanations. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped filling silences that weren't mine to fix. Daniel reached out once. A vague message about misunderstandings, And family being family. I read it twice and didn't respond. Not because I didn't have words, but because I finally understood when silence was the most accurate answer. This was the turning point. Not when I won something, but when I stopped negotiating my worth. Here's where I made my choice. Do you believe in revenge? Or in walking away and letting silence do the work? I want both sides in the comments. Because choosing clarity over chaos doesn't feel powerful at first. Feels lonely. It feels like standing in an empty room after the noise has stopped, wondering who you are without the role you've always played. But that quiet, that's where control lives. And for the first time in my life, it belonged to me. The call came on a Thursday morning. I remember because I was making coffee and the kettle clicked off right as my phone started vibrating across the counter. My mother's name lit up the screen. I didn't answer right away. I watched it ring until it stopped. Then it rang again. I answered the second time. Her voice was tight, controlled. "We need to talk," I said. "About what?" A pause. Short. Calculated. "This situation." I told her I was busy. Which was true. I was busy not stepping back into a dynamic that had already shown me its limits. She didn't like that. Her tone shifted. Sharper. She said my father was upset. That Daniel was confused. That the attorney had overstepped. That Grandpa had been manipulated. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, she waited. I could almost hear her bracing for my explanation, my reassurance, my softening. Instead, I said, "I understand why you're uncomfortable." That threw her. I continued calmly. But nothing was taken from me. And nothing was misunderstood. She accused me then. Not directly. Indirect accusations had always been her specialty. She said I was being cold. That I was letting money come between family. That Grandpa wouldn't have wanted this kind of conflict. I didn't argue. I said, "He wrote exactly what he wanted." Silence. Then my father took the phone. His voice was low, controlled. He said, "You could fix this." I asked how. He said, "By agreeing to what we discussed. By not making this harder than it needs to be." That was the line. I felt something settle. Final. Clean. I said, "I'm not making it hard. I'm just not fixing it for you." He exhaled through his nose. A sound I'd heard my entire life. Disapproval disguised as patience. "You're being selfish," he said. I replied, "I've been accommodating for 30 years. This is what selfish looks like to you because you're not benefiting from it." He hung up. That afternoon, Daniel showed up at my apartment. No warning. No text. Just a knock. Sharp. Insistent. I opened the door and didn't invite him in. He tried charm first. Jokes. Shrugs. He said. This got blown way out of proportion. I didn't move. Then he got angry. He said I'd always thought I was better than him. That Grandpa had poisoned me against the family. That I didn't need the money anyway. I let him finish. Then I said, "You're right. I don't need it." He smiled. Triumphant. I added, "But you needed me to stay small so you could stay comfortable." That smile disappeared. He stepped closer. Lowered his voice. "You're really going to do this?" I met his eyes. Steady. "I'm not doing anything. I'm just not undoing what was already done." He left without another word. That night my attorney emailed. My parents had requested mediation. Then withdrawal. Then mediation again. The trust was being finalized. The clause was executed. 2 rapid payoffs back to back. First, my parents realized there was no version of this where they were in control. Second, Daniel realized there was no version of this where I saved him. Be honest, are you rooting for me right now? Or do you think I crossed a line? Tell me. I can take it. Because here's the truth. Nothing exploded. No shouting match. No dramatic courtroom scene. Just a series of doors quietly closing. And in the space where their expectations used to live, there was finally room for mine. The climax wasn't loud. It was precise. And it was irreversible. After everything settled, life didn't suddenly feel lighter. That surprised me. I'd imagined some kind of emotional release. A sense of justice, maybe. Instead, what I felt most days was fatigue. A deep, quiet tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. I lost things I hadn't expected to grieve. Sunday calls with my mother stopped entirely. Not officially. They just faded. My father sent a few stiff texts on holidays. Short. Polite. Like messages you send to a distant colleague. Daniel disappeared completely. At first, I kept waiting for the ache to turn into relief. It didn't. Stayed complicated. Some nights I missed the version of my family that existed only because I worked so hard to maintain it. The illusion was comforting, even if it had cost me more than I realized at the time. But something else changed too. I stopped bracing myself before conversations. I stopped rehearsing explanations. I noticed how much energy that had taken, how much space it had occupied in my mind. Without it, there was room. I got closer to friends I'd always kept at arm's length. Not intentionally. I just never wanted to need anyone too much. I started letting people show up for me without immediately trying to repay them. At work, I spoke up more. Not aggressively. Just clearly. When something wasn't fair, I said so. When I needed help, I asked. It felt unnatural at first. Like learning a new language with your non-dominant hand. There were still moments that caught me off guard. Family gatherings I wasn't invited to. Photos I saw later through someone else's post. I didn't block anyone. I didn't announce boundaries. I just noticed what wasn't there anymore. And I let it stay gone. The charitable trust my grandfather set up began its work quietly. Scholarships. Community programs. Nothing flashy. Sometimes I'd receive an update in the mail and sit with it for a while before opening it. It reminded me that something good had come from all of this. Even if it hadn't been designed for my comfort. I thought about my grandfather often. About how little he'd said and how much he'd seen. I realized that his gift hadn't been the clause itself. It had been the permission. Permission to stop explaining myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. Some relationships never recovered. And maybe they weren't meant to. That truth still stings on certain days. I won't pretend it doesn't. But I'm not broken by it. If anything, I'm more intact than I've ever been. Looking back now, would you do it the same way? Was the pain necessary to become who you are today? Let me know. Because I don't believe growth requires suffering. But I do believe clarity often arrives through it. And while I didn't choose the moment my family revealed themselves, I did choose what I did next. That choice didn't fix everything. But it gave me something I'd never had before. Peace that didn't require permission. I used to think forgiveness meant understanding people better. Seeing their side. Making room for their flaws. Now I think forgiveness is more complicated than that. Sometimes it means accepting that the version of love you were offered had conditions you never agreed to. Sometimes it means realizing that being chosen only when you're convenient isn't the same as being valued. If I'm honest, I don't know if I've fully forgiven my parents. I don't know if I ever will. And I've stopped pressuring myself to reach some perfect emotional conclusion that looks good from the outside. What I do know is this. I stopped chasing fairness from people who benefited from imbalance. That choice changed me. It made me more careful with my energy, more selective with my loyalty, less impressed by words, more attentive to patterns. I don't mistake silence for peace anymore. And I don't confuse endurance with strength. When people show me who they are now, I believe them the first time. So here's my last question. Is it better to forgive and move on, or to make sure they understand exactly what they lost? There's no wrong answer. Drop it below. So that's my story, folks. If it resonated with you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far Amelia Parker's voice travels. Sometimes the hardest inheritance to accept isn't money. It's the truth about where you were never meant to belong.